Okay, so today we're speaking with Ben Fellows, CEO and founder of Loop QA. Ben, before we get started, why don't you share a little bit about yourself and how you got started with Loop?
Well, thanks for the invite, Sarah. Yeah, it's sort of a journey. I got started with the Loop 6 years ago now. I had the opportunity to get into the world of tech after working on Capitol Hill for a couple of years. I was a West Wing kid, if you've ever seen that show. I had the opportunity to join a startup, which I ran operations for about 4.5 years. Very much learn how to build a plane and fly it at the same time experience. Got very interested in QAs throughout that process, as I'm sure we'll talk more about, but decided that was a gap in the market that I felt like worth pursuing. And it turns out, it's such a mission critical position for so many companies. And at least in the States, there's really no good feeder system for QA. And here we are 6 years later, still trying to provide embedded QA resources. And so it's been a long journey, but yeah, it's rewarding in every way.
So, for those who don't know what QA might be, how would you describe what Loop does? What would be your elevator pitch for, somebody who might be new in tech or someone who's just listening for the first time and, it's just a personal interest of theirs?
Yeah. So a lot of people have probably experienced software bugs before, right? Like if you're trying to sign up for an insurance portal or something like that, right? And something doesn't work as expected. So developing software isn't necessarily the same as developing a physical hardware product. There's something called regressions when it comes to software. And what that means is basically that it's very, very common in software to have previously working features not work anymore. And people are like, well, why? And it's because code is this living product that software developers are editing, updating, changing. And there's a set of practices and methodologies that you go through to verify that that code still is working as expected before it's released to production. That's what the world of QA is basically these processes, these methodologies that QA engineers run to verify that code written by a software developer is going to work as expected.
And that's really great. I'm going to kind of jump ahead a little bit, but now with, AI, I think a lot of companies and I guess the speed to bring something to market pretty quickly, a lot of products that I even use are still a little buggy or people that I talk to, well, that, you could build something very quickly, but it's, pretty buggy. How are you incorporating AI into your business and how are you managing for these products that companies want to release very quickly, but can have a lot of bugs in them?
Yeah, so there's a huge debate in the community, as all computer science, but in general about AI, right? To kind of break down your question into a couple of core things, I think on one hand, QA as an industry is really well positioned to actually grow as an industry as software development becomes, let's call it, more democratized, or in some capacity starts to become like more accessible to people who think that they can do software development. What's interesting though is if you hand a product person the ability to produce an app, they don't have some of the core tenets, at least out of the gate. And so I think that there's going to be a world in which we'll see a lot more software projects released, but the overall quality of the experience might dip a little bit because some of these practices and methodologies aren't necessarily being followed. It's just not because of any intentionality. It's just more just like not having the awareness of what that process would look like. When it comes to AI specifically and how it kind of impacts us as an industry, to me, it's more than anything an amplifier still. It can amplify really great engineers' ability to produce a lot more and be a lot more productive. Unfortunately, it can also amplify maybe a poor engineer's practices and make that code base a little bit less productive. It kind of breaks down into two core camps. One is the agentic component of like, oh, it's going to open the browser and do the testing for us and do all this other stuff. And then the other core camp is this idea of it's an amplifier. It can add more code, but it's still inherently human driven. In QA specifically, there's a lot of people promising magic solutions of like this agentic, it's just going to be able to open the browser. You don't need QA anymore. You can just tell it the acceptance criteria. I think maybe there's a world in which we can get to that point, but I think we're probably a couple of years away from truly complex scenarios. And so for me, it's an amazing tool, but it still is amplifying a QA engineer's ability to do work.
Yeah, that's a good explanation. I think, there's all these different terms for AI, like AI agents, agentic AI, and I think like the agentic is now like the new term. You want to describe that for people that might not know what that is yet?
Yeah. So agentic, and look, I'm not a terminology expert. So someone in your comment section is probably going to say he's completely wrong. So I will just caveat it by that. Agentic basically my understanding really becomes is that when it became agentic is when it started to string together actions. So AI, which first kind of came out, which is LLMs, right? We're saying AI, but it's really LLMs, was ChatGPT. And it was like, hey, it can just return anything right back, right? This is when all of this exploded, like 2, 3 years ago now. Somewhere along the line, what happened was that they basically developed the technology where it could string these prompts together. So it could string actions together. And this is where it became like agentic, right? So rather than just saying, here's this one answer, it can now string things together and it can complete a series of tasks, therefore agentic. Well, then in the world of QA, someone said, well, this is great. What if we figure out how to give it the power to control a browser? And like, for example, Playwright has just released their MCP server, which is basically Playwright's a formal agentic sort of protocol for how it can control the browser. And so then what happened is these agentic prompts started to be able to take actions because they can control the browser. And that's where sort of the series of agentic happened. Once again, not being an expert in any way of how it actually all works.
Yeah, I kind of see it as it's not automating workflows anymore. It's actually coming up with suggestions and taking over some of the work.
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization for sure.
Yeah. So I also read a very thoughtful post. I think you wrote it about a month ago. And there were a couple of things that kind of stood out to me. And one was that the QA was really a customer facing role and that good QA really pushes boundaries for a better customer experience. And that testing is really an opportunity, not a metric. And coming from the marketing side, I found that really interesting because we're always running tests, especially on the digital side. And that's usually part of the quarterly plan. Like, what tests are we going to run? What are the outcomes? How successful were those? But the customer experience one was really interesting for me because when I've always partnered with development teams, it's a lot of the times at the very end, right before a product launch. So we're going to like go through the QA checklist before we actually flick the switch to make the product live. But do you see QA wanting to get involved much sooner in product development?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. So I view QA in an ideal world at the center of all of it. I think that product people, for example, are fantastic at writing really utopian things about how it should work. And then QA's role for product is to be like, that's great, but here's all of these possible use cases in which a real user is going to do it, right? And this is like before it's ever even seen a developer, right? And then developers really, really fantastic about sort of being given a box of requirements and then being able to do it. But oftentimes, if you leave a bunch of assumptions to a developer, they can sometimes make the wrong assumptions. And so they think that they understand it, right? And QA can help even in that process. When I say QA is customer facing, to me, one of the biggest challenges that I have with some QA teams is they're doing all this testing and they know the product really well, but they don't really ever talk to their customer about like what does the customer care about, what are the areas of the app that it cares about. And like the huge underlying component for me is like it is mathematically impossible to never have a bug hit production. It will happen at some point. So the core thing is how do you distribute your finite resources to have, let's call it, the right kind of bugs hit production, or at least not having the wrong kinds of bugs hit production, right? And so like on that front, I think that having a QA team that's intimately tied into their customers and understanding like what are the core things that like you really care about, what are the things that maybe you don't care about so much. Like a shocking number of QA resources are testing things that a customer is like, actually, if that feature had occasionally issues, that's all right with us. And we understand and we appreciate that you know that you're really testing these things, right? And like maybe that's easier in the world of a startup than enterprise. To go back to kind of where and how you said like, okay, why, what are the sort of gaps in why Loop was founded in that sense? To me, QA comes down to sort of three core things. Emotional intelligence is probably the most undervalued in my experience when it comes to the marketplace. The ability for a QA person to navigate the politics of an organization, to talk to a business person about why a release gets delayed, to talk to a product person about why their perfect design maybe isn't functionally right, to talk to a developer who doesn't really want to necessarily talk to you about, hey, there's issues with your code, right? That emotional intelligence to push beyond testing and into quality is really important. Critical thinking, analytical ability is the second tenet that we always think about. We're constantly put in a position of having imperfect information and that ability to think beyond that imperfect information. And then the third is just ambition. Like, so many people get into QA accidentally that they don't really know where it's taking them as a career. And so having that sense of like, do you want to be a director of QA? Do you want to jump over and be an engineering lead? Do you want to become a technical architect? Like, this is an area that is so oftentimes missing for whatever reason from this industry, at least in my experience having talked to people, and having that clear sense of like, what do you want? Why are you in this? Just goes a long ways. And so those are the three gaps. There's probably other things that I could answer. Like I wrote down not a metric being important. I'd love to talk about that, but I'll pause since I just gave you quite the long monologue.
No, I think that's really interesting because I guess I've always worked with QA as part of the product and development team. And the kind of the way and maybe I'm wrong, but the way I'm hearing you talk about it is that it's almost like a team of its own, kind of navigating and connecting all the kind of product and development team.
So I think in the best case scenario, it's oftentimes part. It's all synergies, right? And I don't think you have to necessarily have these defined roles in that sense. And I think that's really best case. I think that when you get into larger organizations, you start to have these defined separate teams. Oftentimes what I find, and so a lot of my experience is more so spoken from the perspective of you join an organization that maybe views QA as simply the end of the funnel and working with them to say, no, that's great, but it shouldn't necessarily just be the end of the funnel. It should be some of these other components. And then people who maybe have been in like TDD or BDD are really like forward pushing kind of QA scenarios where it just, there's the respect level. It's a first class citizen. It's all part of the process. They kind of look at me and they're like, why are you advocating for this stuff? And it's like, well, because that's just not, from my experience, how the whole industry tends to operate. And so I sort of focus on those pragmatic wins, if that clears it up. But maybe it's still just too, esoteric, I guess, in some ways.
When you are hiring or when you're talking to people that you work with, what are you hearing from them about the kind of work environment that they're looking to work in? And, how are you going about choosing the people that you want to hire?
Yeah. So I'll preface all of this by saying right now I only hire out of the States. There's talent everywhere in the world, and I think there's amazing people all over the world. But for my experience just in QA and kind of how we've done it, we've only hired out of the States. What's interesting about the US is that there's no formal feeder system for the quality assurance industry. Yeah, it's a position that every technical company has. There's no 4-year college degree, although there's like 1,000 computer science degrees. Those computer science degrees maybe sometimes will have a course on testing, but oftentimes not. And so what you find is that the vast majority of people who got into QA kind of got into it accidentally by any means. And that sort of leads to a host of challenges. One is they're either not particularly passionate about doing this as a job and they're just trying to get into back into development or back into something else. The second would be that there's oftentimes not great on-site work training. And in a weird way, there's an analogy in some ways to sales for me, which is like sales is this industry where if you can't do anything, you do sales, right? And therefore only like 2 out of 10 salespeople actually deliver like 80% of the revenue. I sort of feel like to a certain extent, like people are like, oh, you're the customer success person. You can do testing for us. Oh, you're the dev that we don't think is necessarily like up to par. So we're just going to throw you into QA. There's an amazing talent pool in QA, but it's kind of that 2 out of 10 experience. On the other hand, I really don't like saying that it's not like the industry's fault or that people are bad or anything like that. I just think it's a question of like intentionality and opportunity to be trained. And for better or worse in the States, that doesn't really exist. And therefore, as a service provider, we can provide that, I guess.
I think that's great. So let's highlight what these great people do and and how companies are using Loop today. Can you talk a little bit about, the companies that come to you looking for your assistance
Yeah.
and yeah, what does success look like for them when they've been working with you?
So we have kind of two core use cases, both at the startup level and the enterprise level. Oftentimes, we're either the first QA hire in an organization. We're sort of building the foundation of the QA operation. If it's at the enterprise level, that's a project maybe that's spun up and they have developers and product people, but they need QA. If it's a startup, maybe they've just raised their Series A and you're staffing up, right? And what we do is we either embed a half-time engineer or a full-time engineer, and we start by building out the QA processes and the fundamentals and maybe automation and some of these other components. And it's really this sort of foundational element to build from. The second style of engagement that we have is going to be more of like a modernization effort. And so it's oftentimes an existing QA team, but there's a directive to either update an old Selenium suite or to add automation because it's just all manual. And what they really want is someone who the team can rally sort of around and who can sort of drive modernization. In that case, we're either staffing a half-time or a full-time engineer, and that person is really working with an existing QA team to sort of drive practices and modernizations, or working with devs who maybe feel like, hey, we don't need to change, we don't need to adopt these things and doing it. In both cases, there's this balancing act of testing and quality, which is basically there's a lot of people who think they need QA from a testing perspective, and what they actually need help with is process and quality and some of these more sort of organizational components. And so what we try to thread the needle of with all of our engagements is basically breaking it into thirds. On one hand, you need to talk about process and strategy and these kind of sort of high level things. The second is the role of test automation. And then the third is just grinding through the actual testing itself, doing the tickets, doing the feature work and stuff like that.
Yeah, it sounds like, that same kind of philosophy can be used on any teams. Like I kind of come in and build marketing teams, or sometimes I come in and revamp the whole team. Or the first thing I kind of look at is, and end up doing a lot of the times, is building the foundation and assessing the team and then implementing and then taking action. So kind of similar.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because it goes back to like, then we're sort of diving into like the best service companies, in my perspective, aren't just delivering the service, they're thinking about the service in the context of the organization, right? So like when it comes to like marketing in your situation, right? It's like you could come in and you could just spin up ads, but it's like thinking about if what I'm doing makes sense in the overall context, it also allows you to do the service that you're doing so much more effectively. Like one of the areas that I was really proud of when I was doing a QA engagement years ago was I felt like a feature didn't make sense. I brought up, hey, this numbers aren't making sense to me. Some of the devs agreed with me, but they hadn't really wanted to say anything. And I felt a sense of freedom being the quality person brought in to sort of question things a little bit. And it got all the way to the CFO. And eventually the CFO was like, look, it's right, but we agree it doesn't really make sense, but this is how the industry works for these ways. But it was such a rewarding moment, fulfilling like there were questions that other people weren't wanting to ask that I felt like the freedom to ask. And so it goes back to your point of like the best consulting companies, I think, take opportunities to sort of do stuff like that, right? To see what the dynamics are, to figure out where do I have the freedom to push as a third party that maybe other people don't.
And kind of just adding on to that, I see myself, I kind of speak about myself as a growth advocate or growth partner. But what I really do is go in and locate problems and find solutions for those problems that could be impeding growth. And that's kind of what excites me. I really enjoy doing that. When you're coming to these companies, and especially the ones where you're modernizing them, are there any problems or kind of mistakes that you see that's common amongst the companies that you go into?
I think that I wouldn't characterize it as problems, maybe opportunities. I think that there's a couple that come to mind. I think the biggest one is just breaking the mold that testing isn't just this one form of sort of component. There's so many variables around it that can impact it, particularly with like a legacy app. So let's assume that we're coming into an organization that modernization. Well, oftentimes let's assume that they have an app that's been under development for like 10 years. It's probably remarkably successful in some ways, but it's just become so feature rich. It's this huge app. So there's immediate things, right? That they're like, okay, well, we just need to test it. Well, there's so many other questions around, well, what's the test environment look like? If you're going to run test automation, particularly with like legacy apps, can you spin up a bunch of environments and can you run stuff in parallel? Stuff like test data and the test sort of data and the ability to reset these. These are all like weird little technical snags, but the problem is that like any one of them can cause a lot more effort if you don't have those conversations up front. And so when it comes to sort of the opportunities I would say for improvement, it's actually sort of a nice template in some ways. Of they tend to fall into a series of buckets around either sort of like what the different environment limitations are, or the test data limitations. But I would say the biggest thing is just trying to make sure that you create alignment with everyone from the get-go, which is, I know, kind of a generic answer. And alignment's just like, oh, eye rolly consultants alignment. But the developers will know that the CI/CD people, oftentimes you'll have some like IT people too involved with those projects. And so just trying to make sure to define it as this is more than just testing. This is rethinking like quality and like what are all these opportunities that just aren't a human clicking buttons and doing.
One of the things that does come to mind kind of with this process and alignment amongst team members is that you're also building trust. And I honestly think if you don't have that trust, it'll be very difficult to get anything done
Yeah.
in any type of organization or across any team.
Testing is inherently an emotional thing, right? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but
No,
it's
that's
like
okay.
we always talk about testing as sort of a technical solution to an emotional problem. If software doesn't work in the real world, it can have really dramatic effects. And there's the like truly horrific dramatic effects that have happened in the past, but like I was in the world of event ticketing. If our system failed for some reason to print tickets, right? Now you have lines out the door at a theater trying to get in and no one's will call tickets are printing. Like it is such a emotionally charged thing that the best QA can create alignment around that recognize if we do our job well, it matters for these reasons. And you can create a lot more alignment when you can articulate that sort of emotional component that you're trying to protect the user from, which goes back to, I'm sure in marketing, you can do similar things, right? So you can create that sort of narrative that creates that alignment, but that's how we think about it in the world of QA.
I think we're, marketing or in sales or, customer success, any of the go to market, you're always thinking about the end user and the customer. And it's very similar. It's, we want to be talking to them. We want to understand what problems they're still facing. How can we improve the product? What are new use cases? The priority at the end of the day is the customer, kind of before even the product and the team. Um, and I think you're thoughtful about your whole process of entering a customer's business or a client's business and, how you build your team and your thoughts on the quality of the people that work for you. And it seems like it carries over into the businesses that you work with. So I'm curious to know how you got started. Like, how did you get your first few clients and kind of how are you approaching, your own growth and acquisition for Loop today?
Yeah. So I was lucky enough to grow up with a mom who ran a company for 30 years. And it's funny because you don't realize all the lessons that you like learned by sort of absorbing that until you start your own company. And then you're like, oh, wait a second. This is all of these things that sort of implicitly were sort of put in the back of my brain. When I first got started, I think I failed on a couple tropes that I think a lot of first time entrepreneurs fail on. It had a very first world problem of I owned a house and my girlfriend at the time owned a house. And so how I started my company was I sold my house and I told her I'm moving in with you, which I didn't probably give her enough of a choice in that. And so I had this sort of $20,000 from selling my house. And I was like, I'm going to hire this guy I knew from high school who was a friend. He was a really, really bright guy and he was with me for a long time. And we're going to basically email a bunch of startups. We're going to say, we're launching this company. We're doing a beta. We're going to do testing for free for 3 months for 10 startups. And we did. We probably didn't need to do that because it turns out like sales isn't like, you don't need, like you just get out, you find the need and you sell the service. But we did it for 3 months and we were able to convert 5 out of those 10 customers to paying clients. And that's what eventually became kind of cash flow positive. But it's funny because it's like, you don't figure out how to make money till you run out of all that money, right? So it wasn't until we had like $500 in the bank that we figured out like, oh, wait a second, we need to figure out how to make payroll and all these other things. In terms of a growth, I tend to subscribe to just a much sort of slower cash flow positive, build a sustainable agency growth. I've done the venture route. I've sort of tried hey, we're going to run out of money every 9 months. We need to be constantly fundraising. You lose so much control of the business in that sense that to me, at least for Loop, it was we're going to build a cash flow positive agency. We're going to be cash flow sort of always cash in the bank. We're going to be able to absorb the ups and downs. And there's a lot of trade-offs to that. You're never going to become $100 million company, but if you can build a $5 to $10 million agency and it's cash flow positive, I think you can have a great life from that. Some people call that a lifestyle business, but I'm fine with that if it's a lifestyle business.
Yeah, it sounds good to me. I think sometimes I like just keeping it small too. I like the more personal aspect of it. And you're not so much pressured by people from the outside,
Yeah.
like giving it to yourself.
And it's interesting, right? Because one of the things that I'm starting to sort of consider is how the economics of software development are changing because of these tools. And like I think about, previously the software company that we built, And it's like, well, it cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars to get the software off the ground. It's like, well, I wonder in today's world, if we had been able to get that software off the ground for much cheaper, would that have put us down the same paths when it came to venture capital and some of these other components? And I'm going to be really interested to watch the economics of all of this develop in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, there's so many actually tools coming out now where like Replit, where people can build their own applications on their own very quickly,
Yep.
or just people even on YouTube educating you on how to build your own agent.
Yep.
So you can become, free up your own time with these kind of automation tools. So, and you don't need the money to do that. So that is going to be very interesting.
No, I completely agree. And so, like, there's so much unknown for the world in tech. I think the best thing we can all do is just try to stay one step ahead. And, that's kind of the best at the rate that it's going. It's like just be one step ahead of everyone else and you'll be successful. It's kind of my mindset.
And that means that we have to work very, very fast.
Yeah.
If you could instantly solve one challenge inside Loop, whether it be scaling, product, hiring, anything else, and you can fix it with the snap of a finger, what would that be?
I think like most people, it'd be great to get more leads. I think that's probably like the number one thing. I think it's an interesting thing because what I say about QA is everyone has a QA problem. No one wants to tell a stranger. It's a really fascinating world to try to build a brand and do sales in because you have kind of two core customers. You can sell water to a house that's on fire, which is there are bugs in production. You just get lucky, right? You send the email at the right time. It's much harder to sell QA proactively. And so if I could sort of figure that out internally, though, I think that, if I had to be self reflective, I think I would love to sort of let my ADD control me less as a CEO. That would be the thing that, maybe less ideas and more follow through at times would probably be the area that I'd call out.
Can you tell us about a client that used Loop and it really clicked well for them? What you implemented with them? What was their problem and kind of what came out of it?
Yeah, so I've got a couple different ones that are on my website. So if anyone wants to like actually read more of the case studies, I'm more than happy to point them to basically the website and watch videos on. But what I'll share though is one specifically from a company called Amber Engines. That was a company. It was a startup in Detroit. And specifically, we were brought in to basically augment an existing QA team. It was a startup that was growing fast. They basically had a lot of the challenges that startups do, which is that you're moving fast and breaking things. Their app specifically had a lot of interesting challenge because it was massive amounts of data and some of the quality things. And one of the my favorite quotes by the end of that engagement was, "Loop is the best insurance policy a company could ask for." And that really was an amazing sort of validating component of this idea of going back to, well, why are we here? He didn't say we caught bugs. He didn't say we made quality change. He said Whoop is the best insurance company that a company asked for. And the reason why is because we allowed the leader of this organization to feel a sense of sort of confidence and trust and relief and sort of sleep at night that they weren't previously sort of able to experience before. And that's always stuck out to me. I know it's not the most like technical of like we went in, we solved X, Y, or Z, but that as a case study has always stood out to me because I think that that's what quality comes down to is it's like, and this goes back to it's not just about metrics, right? Like if you're just like, hey, we need these metrics. It's like, that's great, but what do you really need? You need that ability to just be confident in your releases, confident in your customers, and just let that all kind of go. And that sort of like Loop is the best insurance company a company could ask for was a great moment.
I think that's great. And it's a really good tagline too.
Yeah, I need to be better at that. Yeah, I need to be better at that. Yeah, we have more case studies at workwithloop.com.
So last question is, how do you envision Loop over the next 1 to 3 years? And where do you see it fitting in the future of software development? And what's your personal vision?
Staying one step ahead. Now, it's sort of joking, but I'm not joking. I think it's staying one step ahead. It's remarkably challenging to predict where it's all going to go. And so I think just being nimble enough to kind of absorb all those changes. I think that my goal, I'd love to see us probably double or triple in size. 15 people, it's a nice agency, but I'd love to get to like 40 or 50 people in the next 3 or 4 years. But at the same point, if I can look back and just feel like we didn't get left behind, we're still pushing the cutting edge, we're still able to find really high quality people, I think that's a win for me.
That sounds great. And I hope you get there. I'm sure
Thank
you
you. I
will.
really appreciate. No, it's I will. Yeah, it's if I can do the integrator thing a little bit better sometimes. But no, it's. I'm sure it's. I'm looking forward to the challenge, and I really appreciate the opportunity to join. I never do these kind of things. I was actually host a lot of my own stuff, so it was really fun sitting in this chair.
Thanks, Ben. I really appreciate it.